Hi, I'm Reid Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. If this is your first time listening, you're in for a treat, because here at Grief Refuge, this is where you can hold sacred space for your grief. And this is where your grief gets honored, and you're invited to explore the deeper understandings of your process and your grief journey. You'll find Grief Refuge to be different from other grief-related podcasts, and what we do is instead of scratching the surface about grief, we actually go a lot deeper. Grief can be very emotional, and it can be very overwhelming. My intention with this podcast is to be a soothing voice and to help you navigate this terrain of emptiness, loneliness, uncertainty, or whatever comes up through your own unique experience. I appreciate your listenership, regardless of whether this is your first or your 50th time listening. I sincerely hope you feel more comforted, supported, and cared for as you take another step on this difficult journey. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while you're listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and your personal reflection. Give yourself the space to relax and use this time to allow yourself and these grief-related feelings to run their course. Please use this time to mourn your loss. In addition to today's conversation, I invite you to download the Grief Refuge app. It's easy to find on the App Store or the Google Play Store, and it's free to download. On this app, there are more stories. There are personal reflections, unique perspectives, and deeper insights for processing your grief and focusing on healing. So whatever app store you use, just search Grief Refuge and you'll find it right there. Thanks, and let's move on to today's conversation. When I was in my younger 20s, I thought I could change the world and help everyone heal. At the time, I was a massage therapist, and I had this belief that a 60-minute or 90-minute session with me would completely transform someone. I believed that the benefit to my client would last not just for the rest of the day or week, but it could last for the lifetime. I know, I was pretty naive at the time, but I knew my intentions were good. I stopped practicing as a massage therapist when I enrolled in graduate school, and I started learning about transpersonal psychology. I had this dream of becoming a professor and teaching young adults to challenge their belief systems in order to access a higher level of consciousness. Throughout my experience of a graduate student, the reality of my experience, along with the hardships of the dissertation process and the bureaucratic politics in this academic setting, they had a pretty strong impact on my psyche and my well-being, and I made a hard decision to shift gears. At the time, I had to let go of the dream, and I had to choose a different path to venture on. But now, years later, I'm glad I made the choices I did. Had I not, I don't think Grief Refuge would exist today. Although I had hardships in my experience, it's really important to me to contemplate back on my education and the topics of transpersonal experiences. In graduate school, I learned a lot about techniques that were meant to dissolve egoic boundaries and bring people to a whole nother level of consciousness. And those transpersonal experiences, I've always had those in the back of my mind in connection with the grief experience or the grief journey. I've often thought, where can the transpersonal help factor in with grieving and healing? I'm still seeking clarity for the answers for questions like that. And what I'm grateful for is that I'm meeting wonderful people who can help shed insight and perspective into my seeking. And that brings us to today's guest. Today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Scott Janssen. Scott's a hospice social worker, and he's written dozens of intriguing articles about transpersonal experiences within death and dying. Scott's writings are published in several different publications, as well as it's been made public through national media outlets. What I really like about Scott is that he's a simple man, and I can tell he cares more about love, compassion, and empathy, probably more than anything else in his work. Scott and I had a lovely conversation about how transpersonal experiences can help make meaning within the dying and the grieving process. I hope you enjoy this very important conversation. Well, Scott, I'm glad you're here with me today. I so appreciate you joining the Grief Refuge community and talking a little bit more about what we call transpersonal experiences and transition, whether it's facing the end of life or after death or grief in of itself. I've really put a lot of energy into having this conversation with you. And although it may sound like pressure, it's not meant to be. Scott, thank you for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Well, thank you, Reid. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you for what you're doing. I mean, I really appreciate the way you're being intentional about gathering a community of folks to reflect on deep things. You're putting a lot of light into the world. And it's such a joy to be here today with you.
I deeply appreciate that. And for you listening, Scott and I barely know each other. And so, but I can tell he's being honest. So thank you.
I've been listening to your podcast. They're great.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you. Hey, I want to share the quick story of what I guess inspired me to reach out to you. And I came across an article that you were referenced, I believe it was on CNN, and it had to do with after-death communication. And I thought, wow, this gentleman is a very spiritual approach to the line of work that he does. And I just thought, hey, it'd be a long shot. You know, he's been on CNN, and so, or at least CNN.com. And so I was like, all right, you know, let's give it a shot. And speaking to just how genuine and how heart-centered you are, you responded, and we've had some great correspondence, and here we are talking, and I'm just tremendously grateful.
Well, I appreciate that. Don't be too impressed with the CNN. I'm just a regular guy out here, and I write things here or there, and sometimes people notice and sometimes they don't. And one thing led to another, and I just wound up getting a call from CNN. But that's not a typical part of my day, so don't be overly impressed.
Okay. Well, Scott, so I know that you work at the University of North Carolina Hospice. Mm-hmm. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah, I actually started out in the humanities years and years, decades ago now, I hate to say. I started out on the path to becoming a historian, and I didn't really have the temperament to be a historian. And although I appreciate the scholarly life, I kind of went off on a little vision quest and decided that I wanted to work with older folks. And one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was accepted. Back in the old days, I could get into UNC School of Social Work with a master's degree in American history. These days, I probably couldn't do that. So I was able to switch gears. The system back then was a little bit more flexible with people like me that had different interests. And so I've been a social worker for about 30 years now, and I've been doing hospice that entire time. And over the course of that time, I've learned so much from my patients, from the families that I've worked with, from my coworkers. I hope I've been able to give something back, but I feel like I've received so many gifts. And it may sound paradoxical when you think every day you're going in working with people who are dying and loved ones who are preparing for that moment of separation. Certainly there are plenty of challenges and plenty of pain, but there's also so many important questions being raised and things that remind me of what's important. Over the course of that 30 years, I've mainly been a clinical social worker, but I've been writing now for about 10 years or so. I just started writing as a way to bear witness to some of what I was seeing, to catch some of those stories of the people whose lives hopefully I had touched and who were touching my life. And as I wrote, I began expanding out into different kinds of publications. I've written for academic publications, I've written for literary publications, but basically the initial impulse was just to witness in a respectful and sacred way some of the stories of the people who were touching my life and some of the things I was learning. And I've spent several years focusing, probably about 5 or 6 years, focusing on trauma-informed care. I really keyed in early on some of the work I was doing with combat veterans, and was surprised at the way that, and I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised at the way that early traumas related to combat or other things really can begin to reactivate as you're dying. There's so many potential triggers. And so I got a lot of training in trauma, and that made me realize that, holy mackerel, it's not just combat vets. All of us have the potential to be carrying wounds that, maybe we've found some way to kind of deal with, or we've found some way to kind of contextualize in our life. But when our life begins to change, when we begin to lose some of those roles that are important, when we begin to lose some of the boundaries that we have as we're ill and people are getting in our space, or if we're feeling pain, all of a sudden there's all these potential triggers. And I realized that there's so many people that carry, early, whether it's early childhood or whether it's later in life, or whether it's, the trauma of an automobile accident, or even medical trauma from repeated hospitalizations, that the importance of creating safety, the importance of creating opportunities to help people find ways to stay grounded as the challenges of facing their mortality really has consumed years of my life now. I've written a lot about trauma and end of life, but what that did about a year ago was really started to feel kind of heavy. As much as I value and find meaningful focusing on that, creating safe places for people who are carrying trauma, and to be a source of love and a source of hopefully meaningful opportunities for reflecting an end of life, it started to feel kind of heavy. Every day it was like death plus trauma. And so that got to be a little bit of a heavy combination. I've always been really interested also in, as you pointed out, the spiritual dimension. And one of the ways that that's reflected is my fascination and excitement for what you called transpersonal experiences. Is at the end of life, when people are in that liminal space between the conventional world, the conventional reality, and whatever is beyond, there are all kinds of interesting experiences that people have that we don't always talk about, but they're very common. Things like near-death experiences, which is getting a lot more press these days. Bruce Grayson has a book out recently about that. After-death communication, you mentioned, very common. When somebody loses a loved one, it's very common for them to report experiences that they feel like are communications from people that they love. Normal, healthy, psychologically adjusted people report these kinds of things all the time, and the research is clear on that. Deathbed visions, when somebody is near the end of their life, and they may be oriented to consensus reality, but then all of a sudden they're seeing things that nobody else sees, that tend to be deceased loved ones or helpful beings. And across the board, these types of experiences tend to create opportunities for comfort, a sense of connection, a sense of peace. And so these are kind of ajar with conventional reality, but they're very common in my world. They're very common with folks who are at hospice, either because they've been through the gambit of life-threatening situations. They wind up in the ER, they've been through surgeries, maybe they've had a near-death experience where they've died or come close to death, maybe felt themselves leave their body, maybe felt themselves drawn to some other place, and maybe had a type of life review, maybe met with a deceased loved one. So these types of things, although they're common, even in hospice, we don't always talk about them. And so they kind of excited me, and they kind of suggested to me that the world is so much bigger and in a lot of ways so much more loving than we often realize. And so I gravitated toward really focusing in on transpersonal experiences about a year ago, in part because of that fascination, but also in part because my focus for years on trauma-informed care was starting to feel a little bit heavy. And so this kind of expands my perspective on everything. When I think about, the passion that I have for creating safety for people whose lives involve traumatic wounds at the end of life, when I contextualize that in my larger awareness that there's so much going on that we don't understand, and that the messages that people typically receive from these experiences are messages of love, of connection, of peace, then that really has kind of lit me up and given me a second wind. And I'm feeling a lot of energy around that topic, but a lot of other topics too. So I didn't mean to give you such a rambling answer, Reid. I hope that's okay. But that leads us to about 30 years at hospice. And, just a regular guy sitting here talking to this fella who runs a podcast who I already feel a connection with.
Well, Scott, thanks for going into a lot of what gets you very passionate. Is I can hear the passion in your voice. I can also hear such a genuine curiosity to what's more unknown or what's more considered uncommon and not talked about even in end of life care such as hospice.
Yeah.
Let's first talk about transpersonal experiences, because I think that I went to school for transpersonal psychology, and I remember there was a study done on the definitions of what is transpersonal in the field of psychology. And I think that study concluded that there were, in all the literature at the time that the study was completed, there was over 140 different types of definitions for what was transpersonal itself. And so I guess I've been conditioned to, when talking about transpersonal experiences, always define the terms.
Yeah.
And so I would love to hear from you how you see what transpersonal experiences are within the field of work that you do.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I probably won't have as good of an answer as I could. I know there's a lot of language that people use for these kinds of experiences. I intentionally use transpersonal. Other people may talk about deathbed phenomenon. They may talk about paranormal experiences. They may talk about atypical experiences or nearing death awareness. I like the phrase transpersonal. And to me, what that implies is that the experience itself has some type of meaning that goes beyond necessarily our conventional expectations in regard to experience. It's something that you've experienced has broadened your perspective a little bit and allowed information, allowed perspective, allowed narratives about meaning to kind of become a part of your experience. When somebody's, for example, when somebody's dying and maybe they're focused on the fear that they have of death, or on the losses that they've had in terms of their personal space, or they're focused on resistance to the dependency that they're feeling on others. It's easy to kind of get lost in the stories about how hard and how difficult this is. And sometimes, what I've seen when people, all of a sudden, maybe they have this profound hyper-real dream where they receive a message. And all of a sudden what happens is you see a change of aspect, you see a change of perspective, you see a connection with maybe a deeper part of oneself beneath the storms and the surfaces. So when I use it in the terms of, in the context of hospice, I'm thinking of it as something that breaks through, or is ajar in some ways with our expectations about how reality works, that gives us in a sense a connection with an unseen part of our world that is real, that is meaningful, and that connects us to things that we're not ordinarily aware we're connected with, if that makes any sense.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Now there's going to be some people that are going to have these experiences, and they're not going to define it for themselves as transpersonal. So I don't push this definition. That's how I see it. Some people, have after death communications, and they think, oh, whoa, that must have been some type of stress-induced hallucination. Oh, that must have been wishful thinking. Or some people have near-death experiences, and they, oh, I wonder if I'm as what's going on here. So I don't push this definition onto people's experiences, but I that's how I personally view them. And so it makes me open when that is how people want to kind of process them. And my experience is that most folks who've had these experiences, there's a part of them at least that recognizes them as personally meaningful and real. And if I respond with a receptivity and openness, the chance that that meaning is going to be embodied goes up. If those people are met with being dismissed or being ridiculed or being pushed, somebody pushing an agenda saying, no, that's just, that wasn't a near death, that wasn't real, that was hypoxia, or that was anoxia, or that was, hypercarbia, or there's all kinds of ways in which, especially in the medical field, but also, people out there may have their own biases and perceptions. So if a person has an experience that's potentially transpersonal, and they take the risk of disclosing it to somebody who dismisses it. And there's research on this, at least with near-death experiences, we know that it's not uncommon for folks to be dismissed, or Jan Holden talks about the 3Ds, being dismissed, being demonized if the experience is ajar with somebody's worldview that has to do with religious beliefs, or being diagnosed with psychopathology. Oh, that was brief, that was acute dissociation, what it, so that there's all kinds of ways in which you might have a transpersonal experience, but if you share it in the context of others who may not hold that viewpoint, you could wind up walking away feeling like you've been dismissed or ridiculed, feeling out of sync, feeling like you've in a sense been betrayed by having taken the risk. Or you could wind up questioning yourself, well, was that really real? Could it have been the Dilaudid? And so by defining it that way, it connects me with my own heart center and my own personal belief that the world is more vast and more loving and more supportive than we sometimes realize. And then when somebody has an experience that they inwardly understand in that way, I come equipped with the context for keying in on that and allowing them to process it in their own way that honors and respects that particular interpretation. If I were to call it, paranormal phenomenon, that's different language. There still might be the possibility for that type of processing, but language is important. And I really appreciate that you want to define what I personally mean by transpersonal and why I choose it over some of the other options that are out there, like, paranormal or atypical, or what might, however one might language that.
Yeah, there's a lot of wealth in the knowledge of what you shared too in your personal definitions, and it actually makes me think of some congruences to some of the experiences when someone grieves. You said the 3Ds. I got caught up thinking about a fourth D, and such as disenfranchised. And
oh yeah,
I'm going to share a quick story of a grief experience that I had. It was the loss of a relationship. It wasn't an actual physical death. I normally talk about physical deaths on the Grief Refuge podcast, but in this case, I was deeply grieving, somebody I loved very much in a relationship, and when it was over, I was struggling, and I was trying to work, just trying to live life, but wearing my emotions on my sleeve, crying in public, and being a male from the Midwest, crying in public is a very uncommon experience.
It's a very courageous experience.
Yeah. And I remember I was taking a yoga class, and this was actually the first time I'd ever taken a yoga class. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but the instructor had told me, if as a home base, if at any time you feel uncomfortable, return to child's pose. And so I would do that a lot. I returned to child's pose. It was kind of like this, you mentioned sacred. I had created this, what felt like almost like a cocoon for myself. And I remember the lighting was dark in the room. the mat felt, for whatever reason, it felt soft. These days, these days when I do any yoga, I'm like, oh, it's such a hard floor underneath this mat. But the yoga mat felt really soft, and I was very comforted in what
Mhm.
felt like this cocoon. And I had a moment where I just went inward, and I thought I was talking to myself. And I remember asking questions about the relationship,
Yeah.
particularly like, is it meant to be? And,
Mhm.
I was just focusing on us being a
Yeah.
couple. And I felt, I want to emphasize felt. I
Mhm.
not only heard, but I felt a voice speak inside of me that
Mhm.
just completely vibrated through every cell in my body.
Yeah.
And it was such a powerful force that it just overwhelmed me. I remember
Mhm.
like not jumping up, but quickly looking up and gasping for air, and
Yeah.
because it was all consuming.
Mhm.
And honestly, Scott, it scared the hell out of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like trying to gain sense of reality, what just happened, um,
Yeah.
and almost like overwhelmed with what I would call a sense of grace.
Mm.
And those
Mm.
public tears got even more prominent. And that was, for me, was definitely a transpersonal experience.
Yes.
In, I would call it a voice of God within me.
Mhm.
I have not been diagnosed as schizophrenic or bipolar, but and and yet you're right, Scott. Although I'm sharing it now, this, and truthfully, this happened 20 years ago from the time of
Mhm.
this recording.
Yeah.
Although I'm sharing it now, and I have shared it in some safe containers or safe contexts of groups of people that I trusted that would
Mhm.
understand it as a
Mhm.
transpersonal experience,
Yeah.
I've probably shared this story less than 5 times in my life.
Mm.
And it is because I would expect a lot of looks, a
Yeah.
lot of looks of unacceptance.
Yeah.
How inappropriate. How
Yeah.
could you think that way? Who are
Mhm.
you to believe that the voice of God spoke inside you?
Yeah.
And yet not being socially acceptable too.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. I really appreciate your sharing that story. And it illustrates several things. And I don't want to interrupt. Is it okay if I talk now, or was there more you wanted to kind of?
yeah, go for it, Scott. Love to hear what you
It's
think about
such
it.
a powerful story, and I really appreciate your sharing. And it illustrates a number of things, I think. One is that a lot of times when people have these experiences, there's at least a part of them that knows something real just happened, something big just happened. Whether it's me connecting with God or with a transcendent force, whether it's my inner self, my higher self, however you want to language it, there's often this really clear sense that I didn't make that up. Something just happened. But then the next question is, okay, who do I talk to about this? And some people, they just assume that it was real. So not everybody has unfortunately, I have to say this is true, the presence of mind and the awareness that you did. And I wish it was more a part of our culture that we could embrace when people tell us about their personal experiences without rushing for ways to explain them away, or as you said, to diagnose brief reactive psychosis, whatever. I've heard it all. But so you had the awareness that I need to be careful about who I share this with. I've known a number of folks that the experience was so powerful and so real that they assumed that other people would understand that, and people that they thought they could trust with that. And it can raise defenses in others. That's not a judgment about other people. That's not a criticism of other people. It's these kinds of situations can be so uh, powerful and so different than what we're used to, and maybe not necessarily consistent with our spiritual beliefs or worldviews. Does God talk to us directly like that? Can I access some deeper wisdom within myself? To me, that's a normal part of my daily landscape, but to others, not so much. And so, I guess what I'm thinking is that you had to think about, okay, You couldn't come back. Like, for example, in a culture like Native America, when Black Elk, back in the 1860s, he has, or whenever it was, he has this near-death experience, and he visits the grandfathers, and they give him sacred wisdom, and they give him and they impart some expectation of healing power. He comes back to his people. He comes back to the tribe, and he tells them about this experience he's had, and they all accept it, and they celebrate it, and they even enact it in ritual form. And so it becomes real immediately, and the potential values, the value and messages of that experience become real immediately. We bring an experience back that in our culture, and we can be very materialistic and reductive in our thinking, and we can be very narrow in the way we understand these things. And so you didn't have that context. And I appreciate your story in the sense that it illustrates that, because then you're there kind of alone with this experience. And it would be so wonderful if there was a way to kind of share it. And but we don't, unfortunately, at this point in our culture, live in that kind of ambient culture. And so sensitizing folks to these kinds of experiences is so important. Now, if you had shared that and people had doubted you and dismissed you, especially in the context I'm thinking of people who've had these kinds of experiences around times of death or during traumas, it could have sowed the seeds of doubt, self-doubt. I'll give you an example. Can I tell you a story?
Please do.
I'm thinking of, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the different directions this can go. And I worked with a woman who was taking care of her mom. And she was a wonderful caregiver, but I could see in her behavior, as things were getting stressful, there were some signs of post-traumatic stress. There was some hyperreactivity. There was some patterns that seemed dissociative. She seemed to get overwhelmed quickly. She had exaggerated startle defense. It seemed to get, as things got more stressful, it really became clear to me that she might have something in her past. And I asked her about that. I asked her if she'd ever survived or had to deal with anything that had been traumatic or had changed her life in a way that made her feel less safe. And I knew her pretty well at that point. So she told me about her dad. And her dad was physically violent. He was sexually abusive throughout her childhood. And she said he always used to tell her, you don't tell anybody about this, because if you do, they're going to think you're crazy and they're going to lock you up. So at one point, she's a child. She has this experience where during one of her dad's attacks, she finds herself on this kind of cloud with her deceased grandmother, who she loved so much. And her grandmother's there filling her with love, filling her with connection. I'm here with you. Our connection is always there. Her grandmother says to her, don't worry, darling. He's not able to even touch any part of you that's real. Don't worry. I'm here. I'm here. I'm always here. And she feels this kind of sense of love. She feels almost a kind of unitive consciousness where she's connected to all things. She feels this sense of peace. And then bang, she goes back into conventional reality. And she says to herself, oh my gosh, I can't tell anybody about this because they really will think I'm crazy. And am I crazy? She started to wonder if she was crazy. And so you have this experience that can be really transformative. Wow, I'm loved. Wow, there's a part of me that is whole and safe and cannot be traumatized or profaned in the way that my father is profaning. And so you have this potential experience of that can bring self-compassion. But she takes it in the context of her trauma, in the context of not being able to talk with anybody about it, as a sign that maybe there's something wrong with her. And she lives with this for her entire life, basically. And when we unpacked it, we were able to kind of change that story and bring in, well, what do you think your grandma wanted to communicate to you? What was she saying to you? What did she want you to know? How did she hope that her message of love might impact your life? She only began to bring that into the context of her life decades later, because she hadn't had an opportunity to talk about that. Even after her father was gone and she was an adult, she didn't bring it up because there was that fear that she would be seen as crazy, or that fear. And because it had a traumatic association with her dad's abuse, and we don't need to get into all the ways that trauma can entangle with these kinds of experiences, but the fact that there wasn't a context not only kept her from assimilating some of the deep, potentially healing and expansive messages of the experience. It actually caused her to question her own sanity, to question whether or not she was safe in this world. And so, when you tell the story of Child's Pose and having this direct experience, it inspires me, but also makes me sad that you realistically have to say to yourself, okay, who can I talk with about this? So one of my missions in life now is to spread the word as much as I can so that we can create loving sensitivity around those who are having these experiences, because I'm telling you, they're a lot more common than people realize. You know what happens, Reid, sometimes, and if I may go on a little bit, is a lot of times when we start talking about these things, and I've talked to medical groups, and I always feel intimidated because I think I'm going to get, the materialistic responses. But when I start telling stories without pushing any type of interpretation about where these come from, you know what happens? People start to tell their own stories. Well, you know what? I don't usually talk about this, but something happened with a patient 2 years ago that stuck with me, and I can't explain it. I don't usually talk about this, but my dad had, well, I can't explain this, but, I will say this. When I was an intern, practicing, and I was in a rotation somewhere, something happened to me. And so often what happens when you start telling stories is you realize how common these things are, and how often how hard it can be to find a safe place to tell those stories. And I think there's, in some ways, a longing under the surface to have safe places to unpack these stories, and to maybe think about allowing some of the deeper messages and personal truths that they may hold for us into our lives, and not be afraid of instant materialistic dismissals, like that's just a electrical activity in the temporal lobe or whatever, because none of that's ever been proven. There's no definitive proof of any of that.
I'll tell you what, Scott, you mentioned an aspect of sadness in hearing part of my story, and it had to do with knowing that there's limited areas where it can be told. I actually want to communicate some sadness that I experienced in the sharing of your client's story. And it actually had to do with the experience in and of itself. When you were telling the story, and I guess it's a form of empathy that I have, and I was visualizing this client having this experience. And if I'm not mistaken, the client was visited by her grandmother in the act of trauma, correct?
Yes. Yeah. She left her body.
She left her body.
She left her body. She found herself pulled gently to a safe and loving place that she described as kind of a place of clouds. And her grandma was there just beaming with love.
That brings up a lot of sadness for me. And it brings up sadness because knowing that she has this experience in the act of trauma, because I could label that and I could analyze it as such, like this form of I'm going to call it duality, because abuse is happening in the conventional real world at this time, and yet she has this beautiful transpersonal experience of, like what you described as feeling pure love from someone she had what sounds like such a loving, close, deep relationship with. And that's where it brings up sadness for me, that as a human, one could suffer at the same time that they can feel bliss, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. It really is a duality. And to me, the shift to focusing on transpersonal experiences was a way to kind of balance that duality. When I work with so many folks who are, for whatever reason, comfortable talking about traumas and things that are hard to listen to, and awareness that beneath the surface storm, beneath the pain, beneath the psychological devastation, the emotional devastation, the ongoing challenges that these experiences can present in our lives and the way they can follow us, that within that context, there's a larger reality that's rooting for us, that wants us to know that we're loved, that wants us to know that if we can find ways to connect with that place in moments of meditation or prayer or out in nature, whatever it might be, or just to develop some type of trust, that it can become a source of healing. And so often it unfortunately, so often we don't allow those messages in, or we dismiss them. And I'm not saying I know or understand ultimately where these experiences are coming from or what their ultimate origins are or meaning is. I know for me personally, that's the message I've gotten from working with people who have these experiences when they're dying, when they're experiencing trauma, but not necessarily trauma, when they're experiencing the deep pain of grief, when they're experiencing the impending separation from this world. It is a duality in a sense, but in another sense, to me, it's just a part of a vast, complex, often paradoxical experience of being human. That our pain and our suffering can become portals for accessing higher wisdom, deeper truths, deeper meaning, accessing strengths we didn't know that we had. And so to me, I less and less see it as dualistic over the years, and more is just paradoxical. If that makes any sense. And I know there may be a subtle difference, but I see it more as a kind of a mysterious paradox.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of potential healing energy in acknowledging these experiences. I think there's a lot of wisdom. I think there's a lot of connections that can be forged, and the ways that the world is going now with the tribalism, the reactivity, the disregard for the sacredness of the human heart or the natural world. I really think that opening ourselves up to some of the possibilities, that there's a lot more to it than we think, is potentially transformative for our culture. And I think that the people that come back with these experiences, could be seen as messengers, delivering messages we all need to hear. Unfortunately, it requires that we shift our perspective a little bit to be able to allow people to speak the truths of their experience without worrying about, am I going crazy? Without worrying about, who can I trust with this? Without worrying about it not being taken seriously in the way that they really want it to be taken. But, I guess in another sense, it's kind of human. We're perfect works in process. None of us has perfect empathy. None of us has perfect awareness. And so, I don't want to gnash my teeth too much about how folks don't often get the support that I wish they did, because, we're all imperfect in our own ways, and we're all doing our best. I just hope we can move the needle so that all of us overall can really respond more with love when people tell us an experience that they have that they personally believe is true, rather than trying to push our truth onto them or our interpretation. Just understand and respect that this is true for that person, and then see how it becomes alive in their life. See how it becomes alive in who they are. The after effects for near-death experiences are well documented. When people have the opportunity to really begin to live these experiences, it tends to lower fear of death. It can enhance empathy. It can enhance appreciation for the spiritual dimension of life. It can increase gratitude. It can lower competitiveness and materialism. And we know this. There's been almost 50 years of research now. Ray Moody, he coined the term back in 1975. When people have the opportunity to really begin to live these experiences in a way that's consistent with the meaning they ascribe to it and get support for that, it is almost always a source of growth, a source of healing, a source of connection, a source of opening one's heart. It's when they when they find themselves trying to articulate or figure that experience out in a context that's not supportive or respectful, that's where it can become confusing. That's where it can become a stress. That's where those sacred tears can be misunderstood, and there can be a self-consciousness around it. So I guess I need to be careful about the ramble factor, Reid. I can get wound up on this stuff. So I'll pause there and see where you want to go from here.
Sure. I'm gonna own that I'm jumping to a conclusion a little bit, but I'm gonna go on a limb and say that I think that one of the challenges to this whole topic of what we're discussing, transpersonal experiences, whether it's in the act of the dying process or in the grieving process, I think that the key element is what you touched on before, is this safe place, this safe place to be able to tell a story. It could be a physical place, or it could be an energetic place.
Yeah.
And I think that in the culture that you and I, Scott, we live in, American society, there's just very, very rare amounts of these safe places.
Yeah.
And it creates a little bit of perhaps fear, more than anything. But what I wanted to say is, tying into your story a little bit more, is in the safe place, I'm almost shocked. I don't know who this client is or was, and I am almost shocked that, knowing that it was such a deep trauma, and yet she was grappling with sanity, what sounds like sanity, for a very long period of her life. She found that safe place to communicate this whole experience to you.
Yeah.
And so I just really hope that in the work that you do, can you share with us a little bit about how you would do something like that? How do you mentioned in the beginning receptivity and openness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have like I guess like a formula for what you use in this way to create that safe, I like to call it a container, but like a safe place or a safe container for people sharing such
I
traumatic
really
experiences?
I appreciate the affirmation that you're giving me, and I appreciate the way you're witnessing that transaction that I had with this person and his power. I wish I had a formula for you. I do want to back up a little bit and give some context to the way that social workers and mental health professionals are trained, and then I want to answer your question. I guess the short answer to your question, though, is I guess for me the formula is open-mindedness, safety, and love. And I'll put some meat on the bones, and I will talk a little bit about the ways that I try to transmit messages of safety. But before I do that, I want to say, and you won't be surprised at this, that this stuff never came up when I was being trained as a social worker. This stuff never came up when I was orienting as a hospice social worker. I've done a lot of work with trauma. This stuff came up one time when I was being trained in intervening with people who had PTSD. It was on a training tape, and the person had something. It was actually a 9/11 survivor, and she'd been, in one of the buildings. She had separated from her body, gone to a safe place so she could witness the events. And the trainer, this is the response in my training as a trauma person. The trainer of this particular the training I was taking, she stopped the tape. I guess it was I don't know, it wasn't a tape. I'm an old guy, so I still say tape. I guess it was a DVD or a computer, whatever. She stopped it and she said, "Okay, so we've talked about dissociation as being in a range. This would be acute dissociation, depersonalization, somebody else chimed in, reactive psychosis, stress induced." So they're given a story. Now I'm being trained, and I can tell you, Reid, I gave you one example. I can tell you that it's not uncommon for people who experience traumas that lead to a close brush with death, The prevalence numbers with combat vets are off the charts. They've done some research with NDEs, near-death experiences, in people who have survived combat. It is much higher than in the general population. So the fact that people who are being trained in trauma are being told to dismiss this as things that are psychiatric in nature, or sometimes as things that may be related to physiological processes related to stress, is telling. And so, I mean, I did chime in, and I said, wait a minute, can we have a conversation about this? Because that's one way of interpreting what we just saw on this tape. And so, so trauma, social work, hospice care, I never got any training in this. And and so I thought, I assumed this, and I assumed this because I actually had an experience of after-death communication when I was a young man in graduate school, and I dismissed it because I was kind of, stuff like that doesn't happen. I had all kinds of rationalizations for why it wasn't real, but there was a part of me that knew it was real. We're not monolithic personalities ourselves. We got different parts. Like Emerson said, we contain multitudes. And there was a part of me that caught that experience when my uncle died, and it was buried. And then when I started to have experiences with hospice patients, it opened me up. And so I went to the research. I remember back in the 1990s, I had these experiences with patients that like, whoa, I can't explain that. And that was real. I'm going to go to the health sciences library, and I'll look through the research expecting to find all this so-called scientific validation for all these hypotheses about how this isn't real. I didn't find any of that. And I knew something about experimental design and data analysis. So I could look at these studies and think, well, that doesn't prove what they pretend is. That's not evidence of that. Look at the sample. So I walked away scratching my head, and it really began to open me up to these experiences in ways that I didn't find at the time a lot of guidance for in terms of how to respond to these things. These days, there are some good resources. For example, the International Association for Near-Death Studies has a lot of good resources and some for professionals like myself that can be useful. But at the time, it was a desert out there. So what I began to do was to experiment with how do you find ways to make it clear to people that if they had an experience like this, it's safe to bring it up? How do you facilitate conversations that allow them to ascribe meaning to it without pushing a meaning? Because I was still struggling myself with, is this real? How do you do that? And how do you find ways to do two things, really? Because not everybody experiences these as transpersonal or as comforting. Some people, like I said, they dismiss them, or they're distressed by them because it doesn't fit into their worldview. So it doesn't matter to me what their experience is. What matters to me is that they feel safe in articulating that. And then we have a conversation that allows them to find ways to use it as a source of comfort, insight, or growth, or to use it in a way that kind of lowers some of the fears they might have. So here's what I do these days. And again, there's more research out there that people can look at, but there's not a lot in terms of guidance and rules of thumb. And again, IANS has done some good stuff. The Association for Spiritually Transformative Experiences has some stuff. So, but what I do is I just assume when I meet with people that, we all have experiences across, a number of different dimensions, physical, emotional, psychological, relational, spiritual, and that the spiritual dimension, and you don't have to be religious or identify with a particular faith tradition to be spiritual. Some of the more spiritual people I've known have identified themselves as atheists or agnostics, but there's a spiritual dimension. So I just assume that anybody that I meet might have had experiences that they define as transpersonal. And it's especially true with hospice folks because, they maybe before I met them, maybe they've been to the ER, they've been on the operating table, maybe they carry life experiences. They've had life-threatening automobile accidents. They may have been survivors of combat. They may have been survivors of different kinds of trauma. So, or things that create life-threatening events. So I assume that the population I work with is going to have a higher incidence rate a higher prevalence rate than the general population. And so anytime I meet with people, I always try to suspend any agenda that I have and just focus entirely on them, their language, what's important to them. And then I'll ask questions about what's meaningful to them, about how they want to spend what time they have. I'll listen to the stories that they tell and the way they tell the stories. We'll engage in life review. And at some point, something's going to come up as they're reflecting on their experiences that, maybe I'm going to say, well, when that happened, when you had that incident, where you're taken to the ER and they resuscitated you before you came on hospice, did you ever experience anything that was unusual or kind of hard to explain? Or, when you were in combat and when your plane, was flying into that flak field, did anything ever happen that was kind of unusual to you? And what often happens is people say, why are you asking that? And so one of the things that's important before I ask that question, I try to create an awareness that it's totally safe to talk with me. I'm non-reactive. If people say things, I always try to respond with love and compassion. I always want to get amplification so they can tell me what. So hopefully by the time I ask a question like that, there's a sense of relational connection. There's a sense that I can be trusted, that it's safe. And then when I ask that question, a lot of times I'll get that question back. So there's an opportunity for me to do some things. I can provide a little bit of education that normalizes some of these experiences and makes it clear that they happen pretty commonly at end of life, and that they happen to normal, healthy, psychologically adjusted people, and that they often have a lot of meaning. So if somebody says, why are you asking that? I may say, well, there's just there's a lot of research out there that when people have a close brush with death, a lot of times they don't remember anything, but a significant number of people do. Sometimes what they remember is referred to as a near-death experience, and these are some of the characteristics. Now, other things people sometimes experience, and this is fairly common too, is that when they lose somebody they love, they may feel like they've had some type of communication from that person. That's called, and it has a name, it's called after-death communication. And I was talking to a vet last week. I told him it's very common in my experience for veterans to have visits from their buddies who maybe died. And those visits can come in dreams, or they may be in literal, or they may be in the form of a touch or a voice. And so I may be offering education that's tailored to the circumstances. If I'm talking to a caregiver who's like, ooh, it's kind of creeped me out. Mom, she was totally asleep and we thought she was dying. And then she woke up and she started talking to dad. He's been dead for 50 years. Well, you know what? That's not uncommon. There's nothing to worry about. That has a name too. It's called the Deathbed Vision. And there's research on that too. And it seems to be very common. So projecting openness, projecting non-judgmental presence, loving presence, finding opportunities to just ask the question. If they respond with the question, being able to provide some education that's tailored to the kind of language they use, that's tailored to the kind of images they use, their personal experience. So then when I do that, sometimes people say, nah, I've never had an experience like that. But I usually get a story though, because if they haven't, and this is so common in my experience, Reid, everybody's got a story somewhere. They'll say, no, I didn't have an experience like that, but something happened to my grandma, and I never understood what that was. And so it may lead to a conversation about some of these spiritual issues or some of these issues that raise spiritual questions. But it's also common for people to say, well, yeah, I did kind of have an experience like that. I haven't really told anybody about it. Or, I've only told my husband, or I've only told my wife, but yeah, I did have an experience. Well, and then part of my mental template is I don't assume that I have some type of right to hear that story, because this is sacred stuff to me. And I need to respect people's preferences and safety. And I may say, well, would you be willing to share that story with me? And if they say no, and they almost, I don't know if anybody's ever said no, but I like to make sure that they know that I'm not pressuring you, that I'm really interested and I really want to hear it. But it's up to you. Do you feel safe sharing it? And then, when it's shared, I respond in ways that make it clear that I'm accepting their interpretation of events. And they don't have to try to convince me that it was real. I get it. They don't have to convince me that this really happened. They don't have to convince me that, they got a message from a loved one who had died. They don't need to convince me that they felt like they left their body and were able to see what was going on down below them. And then they saw images from their life flash before them that gave them some memories that they want to talk about. They don't have to convince me in any of that. Or if their perspective is this was all, just deprivation of oxygen in my brain. If they're happy with that interpretation, if they're not feeling any distress or anything, fine. I'm not going to try to talk them into thinking it was something transpersonal if they believe it wasn't. And if that belief isn't causing them any distress, that's fine. So once it comes up, then I have all kinds of questions that I like to ask about. So what does that mean to you? Has that in any way changed the way you look at things? How has that positively impacted your life? Have there been challenges in your life having had an experience like that? What does that mean to you now as you're approaching your own death, your own mortality, or as the person you're taking care of is? So what I do then is let's use this experience. Let's talk about it in a context where it's affirmed and where we can tease out some of the power of it. And I'm not going to push any type of interpretation or agenda. So I just want to hear what they're thinking. Then I ask questions around it. Tell me more about what you were thinking when that happened. Tell me more. So what was the emotional tone of that thought? So I've got all kinds of social worky questions I can ask. But the thing is, most social workers don't learn to project open-mindedness, to send messages that it's okay to talk about this, to directly ask about situations once there's a context in the conversation or relational trust or a relationship, and then to recognize, and there is some research on the potential usefulness of these experiences and what they call post-traumatic growth. There's some stuff on that, but also the ways it can be useful at end of life in terms of lowering death fear, bringing a sense of safety, a sense of balance and context to one's life review and perspective on the ups and downs. So, I mean, this stuff, once you understand that this stuff is so profoundly real to folks who experience it, and you realize the potential, not just therapeutic power, but the power that goes with us being just, beings on our journey. And you have an experience that if you really begin to you have somebody who can help you flesh it out, not just I'm telling my story, but wait a minute, let's pause a little bit before you move on. I want to make sure I got this. So when you were with this being and having this life review, you had this insight. Can you tell me more about that? So I'm slowing the story down and I want to hear more about it. And when you do that, you allow people to gain insight that they didn't even know was there before. And so I don't have, I guess I do have a blueprint. As you asked me for a blueprint, I do have a blueprint. And it's kind of what I've articulated. I mean, I do bring a number of different perspectives into my practice clinically, but it's really about openness, love, responding in a loving way, allowing people to define for themselves what the experience means. If they tell me it wasn't real and I'm content with that, that's fine. But if they tell me it wasn't real and I'm having distress about that because I think it means that maybe my mental status is slipping, or maybe it means that, there's some forces out there that are messing with me, that's a situation where I am going to bring my perspective as a social worker to ask them questions around that to see if there's another way to tell this story. The story is not something happened and it means that I'm going crazy, or it means that, God's mad at me or whatever. Okay, something happened and this happens and it's not out of the ballpark. It's normal. And what does it really mean? Well, it just means that, they may decide that it means that, that there was something going on in their temporal lobe or their occipital lobe or whatever. But when I'm done, I want to make sure that I've created opportunities for any negative stories about these experiences to to kind of go bye-bye without pushing that. And there really are ways to do that. But all the positive stuff that may have not been storied or shared or explored, there's going to be lots of time for that. And the other thing too, and I talked about this in a recent article I wrote for Jerry Powell, where I was really pushing professionals to get on board with this. What often happens when I'm talking with somebody about something like this, if we're doing it in the context of a family system, is somebody will light up like, Dad, I didn't know you had an experience like that. And people kind of get excited to hear about it. And it becomes a source of exchange where family members begin to exchange love and gratitude or tell stories. It can actually lower some of the death fear that caregivers have. And so all kinds of magical things can happen. Or if something else happens, if it creates distress, that's fine too. Let's get it out in the open so we can talk about it, help people connect with their centers, lower the stress level down a little bit, and see where we go from there. So I don't have any presuppositions that people are always going to tell me that these are experiences that are really meaningful to them, but they usually do. But if they don't, that's okay too. Because the main thing for me is it's safe to talk about it. Let's get it out there and see how it can inform and give meaning, and maybe can help you connect with strengths and resiliency at this time when so much of your life has shrunk as you're sitting there in the hospital bed. Paradoxically, and others have noted this, that sometimes when you're dying, the world can really shrink and your body becomes vulnerable and you can't get out. But at the same time, and here's the paradox, at the same time that your body is getting weaker, your spirit, your inward self can actually become more expansive. It doesn't always work that way, but sometimes it can. And so these experiences, when they're out in the open, I have found can really be powerful and wonderful sources of reassurance, of information, of insight, of sharing that can help people whose bodies are shutting down and whose worlds are shrinking feel this kind of almost expansion or more authentic expression of a deep self inside who they really are, when all the roles and the self imposed defenses and all the ways that we seek status and display, when all that stuff kind of fades away and it's just core values, a sense of who am I really, when that begins to express itself, it's amazing. It's amazing. And these experiences, when they're honored, when they're held in a space of trust, can become amazing sources for all that. And frankly, it can really just bring a lot of joy. I've been with families that once they start telling stories, once they know it's okay, well, yeah, I knew somebody one time that I just thought he was crazy, but maybe he wasn't crazy. And then we were laughing and we're talking about stuff and it's okay. And that sets a pattern too, that if something else comes up as we go forward, we can talk about that too. And it kind of sends these messages of, it's okay. We can talk about this stuff and we can find joy in it too.
Well, I tell you what, Scott, there's a couple things that come to mind. One, your experience just has so much depth to it. And I can really tell that you find such a special way to connect with the patients that you serve and the people that you work with. Now it makes sense to me how people find comfort in you as a source of sharing these deeply personal things. The other thing I wanted to say is, you sound like you're just getting started.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're going to be working at hospice for another 50 years. It's amazing. I can hear so much passion and so much purpose in the line of work that you do. I'm just so appreciative that you are doing what you're doing, because as we both know, people in our world need this. They need this type of support. And then the third thing that comes to mind is there's just a lot of parallels in the way that you approach creating this safety, having open-mindedness, and coming from a source of love in the way of being a mirror, a sounding board, a container for everything, for people to share such personal things. So thank you for all the work that you do, Scott. We're we're going to have to wrap this up, but I'm going to ask you one last question.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Having 30 years of experience in hospice and end of life care, I'm so curious what you'd like to see happen as an evolution or a growth in your field in the next 5 years.
Oh gosh, I guess there's two tracks in which I could answer that, Reid, and one of them I could get pretty cynical when I think about the state of our healthcare system these days and what that means for hospice to be in environments where the profit motive and survival fear and false notions of productivity prevail. So I'm not going to go down what I'd like to see in terms of any transformations we could be making with our larger understanding of how we deliver healthcare. But so I'm going to answer it more in the lines that we've been talking about. But I did want to note that the context in which all these wonderful things we're talking about has changed over those 30 years in ways that are not always positive in terms of what we value as a culture, as a people, and how we deliver healthcare. There are challenges that hospice faces as we go forward, but what I'd like to see is voices like yours. And when you say you are a part of the same family that I'm a part of, when I think of hospice care, when I think of end of life care, this is a journey that I kind of walk with people up to the point where separation occurs. And then there are amazing folks like you that have a keen and sensitive eye for those folks who are left to continue their journey. That's as much a part of hospice care as what I do. So I'm going to answer your question, but in kind of a broader sense, in kind of a more inclusive sense, not just to mean what I like to see at hospice, but what I'd like to see in terms of our awareness around the potential ways we can serve people who are dying, but also people who are grieving. And I guess what I'd like to see is for people to really focus in on those core things that we talked about. We don't talk a lot about love in the medical setting. We don't talk about accompaniment. We don't talk a lot about bearing witness. We talk about other things, and even in clinical language with social work, we may not talk about love, but we may talk about accurate empathy or congruence, and we use this jargon, and it's fine. And that some of that's driven by different things and whatnot. But I would like to see us begin to really tell the story of what we do, to include words like love, words like kindness, words like transformation, words like honor and reverence and sacredness. Really, just to key in on the possibilities that go with transformation at the end of life or transformation through grief. So much of what is focused on is helping people cope. And I don't particularly like that perspective. So much of what happens is focused on identifying places where people maybe are not coping well and trying to help them outsource internal and external resources. Just the way we use language can be so clinical. And when you do that, it can create a kind of a presumptive hierarchy where there are experts like me, and then there's folks that I'm helping to interview. I don't see it that way at all. I really wish that we would go in a way where we begin to allow the sacredness of this work and to tell the stories, to create sacred story circles where we can tell the stories of what we're doing, not in terms of clinical language. A caregiver appears to have in deficits and emotion regulation, blah, blah, all that kind of jargony nonsense, and just begin to really tell the story of what we do in ways that opens us up to the ways that this not only transforms the people we serve as they're facing their own mortality or the loss of a loved one. How can it transform us? How can it open our hearts? And language, you started with language, and it was a brilliant place to start. What do we mean by, why are we using the words that we use? Why are we using the language that we use? Why are we, and how do they inform the stories that we tell, the metaphors that we live by, the ways that we communicate with each other. I would like to see a transformation in language to encompass these types of things we're talking about that relate to transformation, that relate to growth, that relate to transpersonal experiences, that relate to love, that relate to kindness in a non-hierarchical way. So, I mean, I would like to see hospices become less and less overly focused on the physical being. Now, we want to control pain, we want to control comfort, but so often the medical model that hospice has tried to expose and to change and was making a lot of headway back in the 90s in doing that, the medical model is still out there, and it pressures hospices sometimes to overly focus on the physical body. And it's so important to do that, to control pain, to control, and to lower the anguish of caregivers who are watching someone suffer with pain. But it's not all about physical pain. It's not all about who's had the last bowel movement. It's not all about respiratory ease. It's really about, and it's not all about alleviating psychological suffering. To me, at the core, it's about connecting with who we really are and allowing our story to be articulated in an authentic way, where the lessons of our life can be communicated before we die and land in people like me in my heart to help me not only carry the memory of all these people that I've served, but to be a better person. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm hoping that we will move into a kind of way of understanding what we do that is more truly interdisciplinary, which is inclusive, but which honors the power of what we've been talking about. There's so many opportunities for insight, growth, shifting perspectives in ways that bring deeper empathy, deeper ease with the challenges of suffering, lowering fears about death, bringing mindful self-compassion, looking at the stories that we tell ourselves and not feeding stories of deficit or judgment, but stories of self-love, of self-acceptance, of embracing imperfection. There's so many ways in which the medical model, the ways that we do psychological care with our diagnostic and statistical manual, I hope we move into a deeper place. I'm not optimistic though, because all the stuff I talked about with funding sources and regulatory environments that prize certain types of things and big systems that want to optimize the bottom line, there's a tension. Everything we've been talking about is the core of what I do. There's a lot right now in terms of how we do healthcare and how we train people who do healthcare and who do mental health services that is unfortunately going in the opposite direction to what we've been talking about. Something needs to pivot. And I think the people that are having these experiences can be pathfinders for us. And it is changing. There's more information out there. A lot of the doctors that I talk to these days, a lot of young doctors, they are so open to this. Not to stereotype, a lot of the older ones are too, but there's so much openness that I'm seeing that I didn't see back in the 90s. And there's a lot of research out there that is pointing not to the probability that these things can be attributed to neurological or biochemical function, but a lot of real scientists are starting to say, you know what? We may never know what's really going on, so let's embrace the mystery. But the data suggests to me that looks like consciousness survives. So not that we need to worry about getting lost in the debate over the origins and etiologies. That's a rabbit hole. But the fact that there is compelling research that flies in the face of people's assumptions about us being nothing more than bones and booger and blood, that I hope that doesn't sound crass, but we are more than we think we are. Science is actually catching up to that, and most people don't know that. But that's a powerful thing because it becomes part of the story. And so my cynicism and my optimism are dancing right now. And it's people like you, Reid, that feed my optimism, that tell me we're going to get there and we're going to transform this, the way that we do this, so that people feel safe. And so I appreciate that. I really appreciate you. And I know I've got a talked for, has it been that long that I've been talking? I just looked at the clock. I will shut up now and allow you to bring us home.
What I really like is the way in this closure you stayed on the thread of the paradox, your cynicism and your optimism. Hey, I tell you what, Scott, this has been a great learning for me. I deeply appreciate everything you've shared today. You're a tremendous source of wisdom, and so thank you for your perspective. Thank you for your voice. Thanks for being on Grief Refuge.
Oh, thank you, Reid. Thank you from the bottom of my hopefully opening heart. Thanks for all you do and for all the lives you're touching.
Thanks for making the time to listen and to learn more. As you could tell, Scott is very passionate about this topic. If you would like to read more of Scott's writings, which I highly recommend, many of his articles are posted on his website, which is scottjanssen.com. And that's spelt in the way with Scott with 2 T's and Janssen spelt as Janssen. So it's scottjanssen.com. I definitely plan to have Scott on the Grief Refuge podcast in the future to further discuss things like sacredness, loving sensitivity, and whatever else comes up. So if you haven't joined the Grief Refuge community newsletter, please sign up for free at griefrefuge.com. Thanks again for joining me today. It's such an honor to hold space for your grief and your healing. If you found this helpful, let us know. You can rate and review this Grief Refuge podcast, or please send us a message at griefrefuge.com. And before we close out, I do want to remind you that Grief Refuge app is available on your phone's app store. You can grab that app for free and get more grief support. It's a pretty amazing tool to have, especially when grief is hitting you hard. So if grief is making you feel lost or isolated, or you just need that extra amount of support, download the app for free and start feeling more comfort and support today. So that's going to do it for us today. I appreciate your listenership. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Please be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.